Late autumn 1985. The Parapamesis Mountains, northwestern Afghanistan. The air inside the Soviet S-125 Neva missile guidance van is thick with the smell of stale sweat, electronics and cheap tobacco. A young radar operator, Private First Class Vasily Ivanov, rubs his eyes, the green glow of his P-15 flat-face acquisition scope painting his face in monochrome. The night shift over the Shindand Air Base corridor is monotonous. Blips for high-flying Aeroflot flights, the occasional blip for a transport IL-76 heading south to Kabul. A new contact appears. Vasily tracks it, his voice flat in the reporting headset. Unidentified track, bearing 270, range 350 kilometers, altitude 10,000 meters. Speed 800 kilometers per hour. Profile, consistent with civil airliner. In the van's dim light, his officer, Lieutenant Denisov, leans over his shoulder. The track is following Aeroflot's route R501, the civilian airway from Tehran to Tashkent. But it's drifting. Just slightly. A nudge south towards the forbidden airspace of the Afghan war zone. Denisov's training prickles. The signature is wrong, too clean, too stable. The transponder squawks an innocent civilian code, but its pulse repetition frequency has a subtle, foreign rhythm. Continue tracking, Denisov orders, his voice low. Alert the intercept officer. And get me identification from Kabul Center. What airline is this? The blip continues its serene, linear path. It does not deviate. It does not hurry. To Vasily, it is just another speck of light on a glass screen. But to Denisov, it feels like a predator moving through a herd, its true shape hidden in plain sight. He is looking at a ghost, a Boeing 707 that is not a Boeing, an airliner that is listening, recording, and dissecting every electronic whisper his air defense network makes. This was the phantom of the Afghan skies. This was America's big safari. This quiet, high-altitude deception formed the invisible front in a war defined by mujahideen ambushes and Hind helicopter gunships. But to understand how this electronic specter came to haunt Soviet radars, we must descend from the thin air of the stratosphere to the complex, geopolitical terrain that created it. The war the world saw in Afghanistan was one of dust, rock, and blood. A conflict captured in the stark imagery of Soviet BTRs burning in narrow ravines, of Stinger missiles streaking towards Mi-24 helicopter gunships, of bearded mujahideen fighters with ancient Lee Enfields and modern American grenade launchers. This was the ground truth. But above this brutal, terrestrial struggle, a silent, invisible war was being waged in the electromagnetic spectrum. This was the war the big safari planes were built to fight. To comprehend their mission over Afghanistan, one must first understand the two battlefields. One born in the Cold War's darkest laboratories, and one forged in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. The roots of this electronic conflict stretch back to the earliest days of the Cold War. World War II had proven that information gleaned from breaking enemy codes or tracking their radar emissions was a weapon as decisive as any tank division. This birthed a shadow arms race in signals intelligence (SIGINT) and electronic intelligence (ELINT). The United States and the Soviet Union embarked on colossal, secret projects to hear the other side's whispers and see through its electronic eyes. Programs with cryptic names like Ivy Bells tapped underwater communication cables. Satellites with immense parabolic antennas geosynced over the equator. An aircraft, modified, specialized, and utterly secret, flew perilously close to borders, sucking in every radar pulse, every radio transmission, every electronic heartbeat of the adversary. From this ecosystem emerged the CIA's Big Safari program. Officially titled the Special Projects Office, it was not a standard military procurement bureau. It was a small, clandestine cell of engineers and project managers whose sole purpose was rapid, bespoke modification of aircraft for intelligence gathering. While the Air Force moved with bureaucratic deliberation, Big Safari operated with a skunk works mentality. Their mandate: take an existing airframe, a transport, a bomber, a civilian airliner, and transform it, in record time, into a flying intelligence platform to meet a specific, urgent crisis. They were the emergency surgeons of aerial espionage. The crisis that would bring a Big Safari creation over Afghanistan began on a Christmas Eve, 1979. The Soviet 40th Army, under orders from a paranoid Politburo in Moscow, crossed the Amu Darya River. Their invasion was a brutal masterpiece of conventional military logic. Airborne troops seized key points in Kabul, while armored columns rolled down the Salong Highway. In days, the Soviet Union had a client state, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan (DRA), and a puppet leader, Bubruk Karmal. They believed they had conducted a decisive political military operation. In reality, they had ignited a decade-long inferno. Initially, the Soviet military faced a tactical nightmare for which it was poorly prepared. They were a heavy, mechanized force designed for the open plains of Central Europe, now thrown into a fragmented, mountainous country with no front lines. But their technological advantages were overwhelming, particularly in one domain: air power. The Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter became the terror of the valleys. High-altitude bombing raids by Tu-16 Badgers and Su-24 Fencers targeted rebel villages and supply lines. To control this airspace, the Soviets began transplanting a critical piece of their military infrastructure: the Integrated Air Defense System (IADS). This was not merely a few anti-aircraft guns. This was the layered shield that protected the Soviet homeland. By the mid-1980s, they began deploying it to protect their major bases in Afghanistan: Bagram, Shindand, Kandahar. Components of the system included the SA-3 Goa, an older but reliable medium-range missile system, often stationed around key airfields; the SA-8 Gecko, a highly mobile short-range system mounted on a six-wheeled amphibious vehicle, lethal against low-flying aircraft; the SA-13 Gopher, an infrared-guided successor to the SA-9, a threat to aircraft using heat-emitting countermeasures; or a network of radar-guided anti-aircraft guns, ZSU-23-4 Shilka, and shoulder-fired SA-7 Grail missiles. These weapons were connected by a web of early warning, acquisition, and fire control radars. This network created an electronic bubble over Soviet forces. For the CIA and the Pentagon, understanding the precise technical parameters of this bubble, the frequency, pulse repetition, scan pattern, and location of every radar, became a matter of urgent, strategic necessity. The lives of the Mujahideen, and the effectiveness of their CIA and ISI-supplied weapons, depended on it. For the ground war was changing. In 1986, through the covert pipeline managed by the CIA and Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI), the Mujahideen began receiving the weapon that would become iconic: the FIM-92 Stinger missile. This man-portable, heat-seeking surface-to-air missile was a game-changer. But to use it effectively, and to understand where Soviet air defenses were weak, the resistance needed a map of the enemy's electronic eyes and ears. They needed to know where the radar coverage was thin, where the SA-8 batteries were parked, what frequencies the Soviet ground controllers used to vector in their fighters. There was the problem. How does one map an air defense network buried deep inside a landlocked, hostile nation, without flying directly into its kill zone and triggering an international incident? Spy satellites had their limitations, often constrained by orbital paths and cloud cover. A U-2 spy plane flying directly over Afghanistan would be an undeniable act of aggression, likely shot down, and would confirm direct U.S. overflight in a war America officially denied fighting. The United States needed a platform that could get close, painfully close, to the Afghan border and loiter for hours listening. It needed to be invisible not through stealth technology, which was in its infancy, but through deception. It needed to look like something it was not. It needed to look like an airliner. A voracious need for electronic intelligence on one side, and a rapidly hardening Soviet electronic shield on the other. The solution would emerge from the big safari hangars, in the form of a plane that carried no weapons, but wielded the most dangerous weapon of all: perfect knowledge of the enemy's weaknesses. The answer to the American dilemma resided not on a drawing board, but in a hangar at Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska. It was a fleet of aircraft that were already veterans of the electronic shadow war, the RC-135 family. Derived from the Boeing C-135 Stratolifter, itself a military variant of the 707 airliner, these were the chosen instruments of the USAF's Strategic Air Command for strategic reconnaissance. But for the unique pressures of the Afghan theater, two specific variants became paramount: the RC-135U Combat Cent, and the RC-135W Rivet Joint. These were not off-the-shelf models. They were the products of the big safari philosophy, constantly evolving, one-of-a-kind platforms modified for specific missions. Their value lay in their perfect camouflage. The silhouette of a Boeing 707 was one of the most common in the world's skies by the 1980s. To a distant radar operator or a pilot making a visual identification, an RC-135 was virtually indistinguishable from a civilian airliner on a long-haul flight. This was the genesis of the deception. The United States would fly some of its most sensitive intelligence missions in an aircraft that screamed civilian. But the internal reality was anything but civilian. The big Safari modifications transformed these aircraft into flying supercomputers and signal libraries. The primary mission of the RC-135W rivet joint was signals intelligence (SIGINT). Its crew of up to 32 included not just pilots and navigators, but a battle staff of electronic warfare officers, linguists and intelligence analysts. Their tools were banks of receivers and spectrum analyzers that could sweep millions of frequencies per second, from the low-frequency chatter of battlefield radios to the high-frequency pulses of fire control radars. They could pinpoint the location of an emitter through triangulation, identify its type and even its specific fingerprint, and if it was a communication signal, often intercept and translate it in near real time. Rivet joint was an electronic vacuum cleaner, designed to build a complete order of battle of the enemy's electronic emissions. Its more specialized cousin, the RC-135U combat cent, was a rarer beast. Only 2 were ever built. Its focus was electronic intelligence (ELINT) of the most technical kind. While rivet joint listened for communications, combat cent was designed to dissect enemy radar systems. Its most distinctive feature was a suite of purpose-built, direction-finding antennas housed in enormous boat-like fairings on the sides of its forward fuselage, the cheek arrays. It also sported a large bulbous nose radome and a protruding chin fairing. These antennas allowed it to perform a critical task, precisely characterizing the performance of Soviet air defense and fighter intercept radars. It could determine a radar's frequency agility, its pulse repetition interval, its scan pattern, its power, and its exact range. This data was gold. It was fed directly into the U.S. electronic warfare database to program jammers like the AN/ALQ-99 on EF-111 Ravens and IS-6B Prowlers, and to design countermeasures for aircraft like the F-117 stealth fighter, which was then in secret development. To understand a radar with this intimacy was to know how to blind it. The operational plan for Afghanistan, codenamed and classified to this day, was audacious in its simplicity. From their forward operating locations, primarily Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska for the Northern Pacific and Arctic routes, and Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan for the Asian theater, these RC-135s would launch on routine training missions. Their filed flight plans would show them operating in international airspace. Once airborne, they would proceed to carefully chosen orbits, or racetrack patterns, along the periphery of Afghanistan. The key orbits were the Afghan Gap in the north. Flying from the Mediterranean, they would traverse Iranian airspace, with tacit, secret permission from elements within the post-revolutionary Iranian government, which also despised the Soviet presence in 1. Afghanistan, and then orbit along the Soviet-Afghan border near Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. 2. The Pakistani corridor in the south. From the Arabian Sea, they would enter Pakistani airspace with full cooperation from the ISI and the government of Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq, a staunch U.S. ally in the anti-Soviet jihad. They would then orbit along the volatile Afghan-Pakistani border, listening to communications and radar emissions from Soviet bases at Kandahar and Jalalabad. In both scenarios, the aircraft would be just outside, or skimming the very edge, of the theoretical engagement envelope of Soviet SA-3 and SA-8 batteries inside Afghanistan. They were close enough to gather crystal-clear signals, but legally just over the border in neutral or friendly airspace. Their civilian profile was their shield. To fire a missile at a target that looked, for all intents and purposes, like an Iranian Airways or Pakistan International Airlines flight, would be a catastrophic political escalation. The Soviets would have to be absolutely certain. And the big Safari planes were designed to ensure they never could be. This high-altitude cat-and-mouse game created a paradox for Soviet air defense commanders. They knew they were being watched, probed, and mapped. They could see the tracks on their scopes. They could, at times, even see the aircraft visually, a glint of silver at high altitude. But the evidence was always just ambiguous enough, the profile just innocent enough, to stay the hand on the trigger. It was a psychological operation conducted with antennas and transponder codes, plunging the Soviet military into a state of frustrated vigilance. The stage was now occupied by the key players, the sophisticated, deceptive sensor platform and the formidable yet baffled air defense network. To understand why this confrontation was so potent, we must dissect it from multiple perspectives. From the outside, the RC-135U combat cent was an awkward, almost ungainly creature. Where the lines of a standard 707 were sleek, the combat cent was distorted by bulging protrusions. Its most defining features were the 2 massive, boat-shaped fairings flanking the forward fuselage, giving it a puff-cheek appearance. These housed the AN/ALQ-125 Senior Ruby system, an advanced set of steerable parabolic dish antennas behind radio-transparent panels. They could be physically aimed at a target emitter with precision, allowing for highly accurate direction finding. The nose was not pointed, but blunted by a large, bulbous radome, housing additional antennas for high-band frequency coverage. Underneath the cockpit, a prominent hog nose or chin fairing contained more receivers and a terrain-following radar, a relic from its earlier testbed days. The aircraft's skin was peppered with blade antennas, small domes and dielectric panels, each a portal to a different slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. Inside, the civilian illusion evaporated completely. The standard passenger cabin was gutted. In its place stood a forest of black boxes, cooling racks and cabling. Banks of reel-to-reel tape recorders, the era's data storage, hummed constantly. Oscilloscopes and spectrum analyzers glowed with green and amber traces. The air smelled of ozone, hot electronics, and chilled, processed air from the powerful environmental control systems needed to cool the tons of vacuum tube and early solid-state computing equipment. Workstations lined the walls, each manned by a specialist. One electronic warfare officer, EWO, might be dedicated solely to tracking the specific frequency bands of Soviet Fan-Song fire control radars for SA-2 missiles. Another linguist, wearing a headset, might be tuned to the tactical VHF frequencies used by Soviet helicopter pilots coordinating ground assaults. A third analyst could be mapping the location of a new unidentified emitter, plotting its coordinates on a paper chart, building the real-time electronic map of the battlefield below. The crew's mission was a high-stakes puzzle. They weren't just collecting data, they were processing it. A radar's unique fingerprint, the slight imperfections in its pulse timing, its frequency drift, could identify not just the type of system, but sometimes the specific unit operating it. Was that SA-8 battery the one normally stationed at Bugram, or had it been moved to support an offensive in the Panjshir Valley? The answer had direct consequences for Mujahideen supply routes. The tapes recorded on these missions would be analyzed for weeks by ground-based intelligence agencies like the National Security Agency, NSA, and the Air Force Technical Applications Center, AFTAC. But the most urgent findings, a new radar activation, a sudden surge in communications traffic indicating a major operation, could be relayed via secure satellite data link back to command centers, and from there, through the CIA, to the ISI and the Mujahideen commanders in the field. The RC-135 was a node in a global nervous system of intelligence. For the aircrews of the 55th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, the mission began not on the runway, but in the vault-like secrecy of the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, SEIF, at Eielson or Kadena. They were read into the mission details, the specific orbits, the priority targets, the emergency procedures if intercepted or fired upon. The mood was professional, devoid of Hollywood bravado. These were not fighter jocks. They were technicians, scholars of the electromagnetic spectrum. Many were career aviators with advanced degrees in engineering or electronics. The pilots and navigators were among the best in the Air Force, trained for hours of monotonous, precise flying, holding a racetrack pattern over a patch of empty ocean or desert with pinpoint accuracy. A deviation of a few miles could put them in hostile airspace or degrade the angle of their collection. Takeoff was heavy, the aircraft laden with fuel for missions that could last 12 hours or more. Once on station, the atmosphere inside shifted. The constant, droning hum of the 4 CFM56 turbofan engines became a white noise backdrop. The crew compartment was dim, lit mostly by the soft glow of instrument panels and radar scopes. Conversation was minimal, conducted through intercom headsets. The mission crew spoke in a jargon of acronyms and numbers. Emitter at bearing 275, likely a flat face, acquisition radar, signal strength increasing. Copy logging. Monitor for associated low-blow fire control. The tension was not of imminent dogfights, but of a relentless cognitive pressure. A missed signal, a misidentified frequency, could mean a gap in the intelligence picture. A gap could mean a Stinger team walking into an SA-8's kill zone, or a Mujahideen convoy being spotted by a hovering Hind. There was a profound isolation to their war. Outside their small, pressurized world, a brutal conflict raged. They could sometimes see the brown haze of dust and smoke over Afghanistan. On their scopes, they might see the blips of Soviet fighters scrambling from Bugram. But their reality was one of graphs, signals, and data streams. The human cost of the war below was translated into sterile intelligence reports. Yet they knew their work had direct, lethal consequences. The electronic fingerprints they collected enabled the jamming systems that protected later U.S. aircraft in conflicts like the Gulf War. The radar locations they pinpointed were used to plan suppressive strikes. They were the unblinking eyes and ever-listening ears, the ghost in the machine that gave the invisible hand of American support its reach and precision. The psychological weight was unique. A bomber crew risks flak and fighters. A reconnaissance crew in an RC-135 risked a more insidious threat, a mistaken judgment by a Soviet pilot or ground controller who decided the airliner was a threat. They flew knowing their primary defense was the enemy's confusion and their own government's plausible deniability. It was a war of perception fought from a cockpit. From within their electronic cocoon, the crew monitored a vast, hidden landscape. But on the ground, the operators they were studying were experiencing a very different kind of tension, one of growing suspicion and institutional frustration. On the ground in Afghanistan, the men of the Soviet PVO Strany, Air Defense Forces, and the radio-technical troops faced a cognitive war they were not trained to win. Their doctrine was built for clarity: identify friend or foe, assess threat level, engage. The system was rigid, hierarchical. A radar operator like Private Ivanov was not paid to interpret anomalies. He was paid to report contacts according to strict parameters. His tools, while effective, were of an earlier generation than the American systems listening to them. The P-15 flat-face acquisition radar used for early warning had a long range but low precision. The fan-song and low-blow fire control radars of the SA-2 and SA-3 systems emitted powerful, complex pulses that were easily characterized by the RC-135's sensitive receivers. The newer SA-8 Gecko system was more dangerous. Its radars were mounted on the vehicle itself, making it mobile and harder to track, and it used a different frequency band. But even it had a recognizable signature. The operator's scope showed a two-dimensional world of blips and azimuth lines. An airliner on a scheduled flight had a predictable pattern: a steady speed, a constant altitude, a known transponder's squawk code, mode 3/A in civil aviation parlance, and it adhered strictly to published airways. The big Safari aircraft mimicked this perfectly, up to a point. The first clue was often the transponder. While it squawked a civilian code, sophisticated Soviet IFF identification friend or foe, interrogators might receive a garbled or non-standard response, or notice the timing was slightly off. The second clue was its persistence. A civilian flight would transit and disappear. The RC-135 would arrive on the edge of the scope and then stay, tracing a lazy, oblong racetrack pattern for 6, 8, 10 hours. No commercial flight did that. The third and most infuriating clue was its behavior when probed. If a Soviet ground controller, suspicious, directed a fighter to investigate, the RC-135 would never run. It would continue its orbit, calm and steady. A Soviet MiG-25 Foxbat interceptor, screaming upwards at Mach 2.5, would close the distance rapidly. The pilot would get a visual: a large four-engine jet, painted in a generic white and gray scheme, with no visible national markings. It looked like a dozen other airliners. As the fighter approached, often close enough to see the faces in the cockpit windows, the rules of engagement tightened like a vice. Without positive identification as a military target, firing was politically impossible. The pilot would radio back: asterisk, it appears to be a Boeing 707 type civilian aircraft. Asterisk, the order would come: break off and return to station. For the Soviet chain of command, this created a feedback loop of frustration. Reports from radar sites and interceptor pilots piled up on the desks of KGB and GRU, military intelligence, officers in Moscow. They knew what the Americans were doing. Their own intelligence services likely had files on the RC-135's capabilities. But knowing and proving are different things in the arena of international brinkmanship. To shoot down a plane that was, at the moment of destruction, legally in international or Pakistani airspace, would be an act of war with the United States. It would provide incontrovertible proof of direct U.S. involvement and could trigger a severe escalation. The Soviet leadership, already bogged down in a costly quagmire, was not seeking a wider war with NATO. Thus, the Phantom was tolerated, its existence a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken rules of the Cold War's shadow battles. The American operation was a masterclass in what is known in intelligence circles as a ferret mission, an aircraft designed to ferret out electronic signals. But beyond the technical collection, the mission relied on a layered, psychological deception. This was not a passive disguise, it was an active performance. The first layer was visual and transactional. The aircraft were deliberately painted in subdued, generic color schemes. While not exact replicas of a specific airline, they evoked the ubiquitous look of a dozen charter or cargo carriers. At a distance, the distinctive cheek fairings of the RC-135U could be mistaken for passenger windows. The crews maintained strict light discipline at night, with cabin windows blacked out and only essential navigation lights on, mimicking a civilian red-eye flight. The second layer was procedural. Their flight plans, filed with international aviation authorities, would show them operating on legitimate airways. They would maintain constant communication with civilian air traffic control, using standard pilot jargon and call signs that sounded innocuous. This created a paper trail of normalcy. If the Soviet Union ever lodged a diplomatic protest, the U.S. State Department could point to the filed flight plan and ATC recordings as proof of a routine navigation or training flight. The third and most critical layer was electronic. This was a double-blind game. The RC-135s were equipped with the very latest in Identify Friend or Foe, IFF, transponders. When interrogated by Soviet radar, they could send back a coded signal that, while not a proper military friend code, was a legally compliant civilian mode 3/a response. It said, "I am a civilian aircraft, here is my assigned code." They also employed sophisticated electronic countermeasures (ECM), but not in an overt, jamming manner. Instead, they might use subtle, electronic masking techniques, emitting low-power noise or deceptive pulses on the same frequency as their own skin paint radar returned to. Make their exact range and speed harder to pinpoint on Soviet scopes, without announcing their presence as an electronic warfare platform. The entire operation was a gamble on Soviet risk aversion. The Americans calculated that the combination of visual ambiguity, procedural legitimacy, and the catastrophic political cost of a mistake would stay the Soviet hand. Every successful mission reinforced this calculation. The RC-135 would depart its orbit, its tapes full, and return to base. In the back, the analysts would begin the detailed post-mission report, translating the raw signals into a map of Soviet vulnerabilities. That map would soon journey from the sterile processing centers of Maryland and Nebraska to the dusty, desperate hands of guerrillas in the mountains of Paktia and Nangarhar. The silent war of antennas and deception was a sustained, grinding pressure. But no such tension can hold forever. The climax would not be a single, thunderous battle, but a slow, simmering realization that would force a fundamental shift in the hidden dynamics of the conflict. The turning point was not a day but a season, a slow, corrosive drip of realization that eroded Soviet confidence in their electronic shield. It culminated in the spring and summer of 1986, a period that coincides with two of the most consequential developments in the war: the full deployment of the Stinger missile to the Mujahideen, and the Soviet military's desperate shift towards unrestricted air power to compensate for stalemate on the ground. The big safari missions were the invisible thread connecting these two realities. The incident that most starkly illustrates this turning point is drawn from declassified after-action reports and veteran accounts of the 55th SRW. While specific mission dates remain classified, the pattern is clear. An RC-135U combat cent, flying from a forward location in the Middle East, executes a mission along the northern Afghan Gap. Its orbit is carefully plotted to skirt the airspace of Iran and the southern borders of the Soviet republics of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. To the north lies the formidable Soviet Homeland Air Defense Network. To the south, just miles away, the war. The crew is tasked with a high-priority collection priority, mapping the entire electronic order of battle for the Shindand Air Base Complex in western Afghanistan. Shindand was a crucial Soviet hub for air operations against Iranian-backed Mujahideen and a forward staging area. The mission is long, demanding intense focus. For hours, the specialists on board catalog everything. They note the precise activation times of the early warning radars. They record the unique frequency hopping patterns of the SA-8 Gecko batteries ringing the base. They intercept and record the ground-controlled intercept (GCI) chatter between Soviet officers in bunkers and MiG-23 MLD Flogger pilots patrolling the border. The linguists identify call signs, unit designators, and the tense, clipped language of an air defense network on edge. Then, something new appears on the spectrum analyzers. A faint, high-frequency signal, unlike the familiar pulses of the SA-3 or the distinct buzz of the SA-8 search radar. The electronic warfare officer (EWO), tasked with radar characterization, locks onto it. The signal is weak, indicating it is either distant, low-powered, or both. It has a complex, agile waveform. The EWO consults his massive physical library of Soviet radar signatures, thick binders of signal profiles known as Elent binders. There is no match. This is a new, unknown system. The crew's focus sharpens. All available receivers are tasked to triangulate its location and dissect its parameters. The direction-finding antennas in the cheek fairings rotate minutely, hunting for the strongest bearing. Over the next hour, through painstaking work, they pinpoint it. The emitter is not at Shindand. It is mobile, moving along a road corridor south of Herat. The analysis of its signal reveals its purpose. It is a fire control radar, but one designed for a missile system with a much longer range and higher altitude engagement capability than the SA-8. The data is immediately flagged as priority. A secure, burst transmission is sent via satellite to the National Security Agency at Fort Meade and to the CIA's Langley headquarters. The message is clear. The Soviets are testing or deploying a new, more capable air defense system inside Afghanistan. The hypothesis, later confirmed, is that it is the SA-11 Gadfly, or a precursor system, a significant upgrade in technology. This intelligence has an immediate, tactical impact. Within days, warnings are relayed through covert channels to Mujahideen groups operating near Herat. Avoid this road. Soviet air defenses there are now more lethal and have longer reach. But the strategic impact is deeper. For the Pentagon, the successful identification of this system validates the entire RC-135 program. It proves that the aircraft can not only monitor known threats but discover new ones as they are being fielded. The electronic map is not static. It is a living document, and the big safari plane is its scribe. Concurrently, on the southern orbit along the Pakistan border, RC-135W rivet joint aircraft are performing an equally vital, but more human task. They are mapping the communication network of the Soviet 40th Army. They identify the frequencies used by regimental and divisional headquarters. They learn the daily schedule of radio checks, the patterns of traffic between forward air controllers and helicopter squadrons. Most importantly, they begin to identify a critical vulnerability. The secure communications linking Soviet Spetsnaz special forces to their command are often compromised. Either the encryption is weaker than believed or, more likely, in the heat of battle, units revert to simpler, unencrypted codes for speed. This SIGINT goldmine is processed, translated, and fed into the pipeline. The climax of this electronic war is not a moment of violence against the RC-135s themselves, but the moment their collected intelligence is weaponized. The Stinger missiles, now flowing into Afghanistan, are not fired blindly. The Mujahideen are taught, based on the radar maps derived from big safari missions, where Soviet helicopter corridors are, and where the protective umbrella of the SA-8s ends. They are taught to ambush Soviet convoys in radio, dead zones, identified by the rivet joint's traffic analysis. The psychological impact on Soviet forces is profound. Their technology, their primary advantage, seems suddenly transparent. Their secure communications feel exposed. The invisible, omnipresent listener in the sky has made the very air they breathe feel monitored. This pervasive sense of exposure would not go unanswered. The Soviet military, prideful and technologically proficient, would now be forced to craft a response to a threat that danced just outside the reach of their rules of engagement. The turning point was now upon them, demanding a decision. The Soviet response to the Phantom reconnaissance was a compound of fury, innovation, and ultimately tragic miscalculation. It unfolded on two parallel tracks, one technical and tactical, the other geopolitical and desperate. Together, they would expose the limits of the airliner deception and push the silent war to its brink. Track 1 was the domain of the Soviet Pvostrany and the GRU. Frustrated by the legal shackles that prevented them from engaging the RC-135s directly, they launched a counter-reconnaissance campaign of their own. Their goal was to fingerprint the American aircraft with such irrefutable specificity that they could justify an intercept, a forced landing, or even an engagement. They deployed their own signals intelligence planes, modified IL-20 Kude aircraft, to fly parallel tracks on the Soviet side of the border, attempting to collect the RC-135's own electronic emissions. Ground stations in Afghanistan and the southern Soviet republics were ordered to conduct non-cooperative target recognition analysis, studying the radar cross-section, engine modulation, and even the thermal signature of the mysterious aircraft, looking for any deviation from a true Boeing 707. Most aggressively, they began a campaign of aggressive harassment. Soviet interceptor pilots, now briefed to suspect any 707 on the periphery, began practicing new tactics. A favored method was the head-on pass. A MiG-25 or Su-15 Flagon, would approach the RC-135 at high speed from the front, breaking off at the last possible moment, rocking the larger aircraft with their jet wash. The intent was to intimidate the crew, force them to break orbit, and perhaps capture clear photographic evidence of the specialized antennas and sensor arrays that would prove its military purpose. RC-135 crews reported being buzzed, so closely they could see the details of the pilot's helmet. The Soviet aircraft would often activate their own fire control radars, locking on to the RC-135, flooding the American aircraft's radar warning receivers with the piercing, audible tone of an imminent missile launch. For the crews inside the RC-135, these were moments of stark terror, a violent reminder that their civilian disguise was tissue-thin. Yet procedure held. The pilots were trained to maintain course and speed, to not react militarily, to continue broadcasting their civilian squawk. Their survival depended on the Soviet pilots' discipline. It was a brutal game of chicken played at 35,000 feet. Track 2 was born in the Kremlin. The Politburo, receiving reports from the KGB on the devastating effectiveness of the Stinger, an effectiveness enabled by precise intelligence, and the apparent impotence of their air defenses to stop the reconnaissance that guided it, authorized a fateful escalation. In 1986, under the command of General Mikhail Zaitsev, the Soviet military unleashed a new strategy of overwhelming, punitive air power. The goal was to crush the Mujahideen through sheer destruction, making the intelligence gathered by the Americans irrelevant by annihilating the targets. This included the increased use of area denial weapons like fuel-air explosives, FAEs, and the strategic bombing of villages suspected of supporting the resistance. This escalation created a perverse opportunity for the big safari missions. The surge in Soviet air operations generated a torrent of electronic signals. More radars were active, more communications networks were buzzing, more data was flowing. The RC-135 orbits became even more valuable. But the increased Soviet desperation also raised the stakes. A cornered adversary is more dangerous. The shadow of a horrific precedent now fell across every mission, the shooting down of Korean Airlines Flight 007. KL-007, shot down by a Soviet Su-15 over the Sea of Japan in 1983, was the ultimate nightmare scenario. The Soviets had misidentified a civilian Boeing 747 as a U.S. RC-135. The tragedy, which killed 269 civilians, demonstrated the lethal potential of mistaken identity in the tense airspace of the Cold War. For the crews flying the real RC-135s near Afghanistan after 1983, the KAL-007 disaster was not a historical footnote. It was a constant, grim reminder. The Soviets had proven capable of the catastrophic mistake. The only thing preventing a repeat over Afghanistan was the heightened scrutiny and the fact that the RC-135s were technically not in Soviet airspace. But as harassment intensified, the margin for error vanished. The climax of this pressure cooker arrived during a Rivet joint mission in late 1987. Operating from a Pakistani base on a particularly sensitive collection task, the aircraft was orbiting near the Khyber Pass. Soviet activity was at a fever pitch due to a major offensive in the region. 2 MiG-23 floggers were scrambled from an airfield in Afghanistan. Unlike previous intercepts, these fighters did not make a single pass and retreat. They took up station on either wing of the RC-135, so close that the American pilot could see the details of the missiles slung under their wings. For over 20 minutes, they shepherded the American aircraft, attempting to force it to deviate from its orbit, to turn south to leave the area. Radio calls on the international distress frequency went unanswered by the Soviets. Inside the Rivet joint, the tension was paralyzing. The crew was trained for this, but training could not replicate the visceral reality of being boxed in by armed fighters whose intentions were unknown. The mission commander faced a choice: abort the mission and lose critical intelligence, or hold position and risk an accident, or a deliberate, plausibly deniable attack. He held position. The RC-135 maintained its orbit, its crew continuing their work, recording the very communications traffic that was likely coordinating the harassment. The Soviet fighters, after what seemed an eternity, finally peeled away, low on fuel. The crisis passed, but the message was received in Washington and Moscow alike. The game had changed. The Soviets were signaling that their tolerance was at an end. The sanctuary of the civilian disguise was crumbling under the weight of wartime necessity. The turning point was now complete. The big safari planes had achieved their greatest intelligence coup, the real-time monitoring of a Soviet military in transition to a more brutal doctrine. But in doing so, they had painted a target on their own backs. The silent war was silent no longer. It had escalated to the rim of conflict, and the aftermath would redefine the rules of aerial espionage for the post-Cold War world. The immediate, tactical aftermath of the RC-135 missions was written not in mission reports at Offutt Air Force Base, but in the skies and valleys of Afghanistan. The intelligence harvested during those tense orbits in 1986 to 1988 became the bedrock of the Mujahideen's most devastating victories against Soviet air power. The electronic maps created by Combat Scent and Rivet Joint were distilled into simple, actionable instructions for Stinger teams. They knew the lanes through mountain passes that were covered only by older, less mobile SA-3 systems, or the times when SA-8 batteries rotated positions, creating brief windows of vulnerability. They knew which valleys were dead to Soviet ground control intercept radar, allowing helicopters to fly blind. The result was a catastrophic rise in Soviet aviation losses. From a pre-Stinger loss rate of roughly 1 aircraft per month, the figure skyrocketed. In 1986 and 1987, over 200 Soviet aircraft were confirmed shot down by Stingers and other ground fire, with the Stinger accounting for a dominant share. The psychological impact was even greater. Soviet pilots, once lords of the Afghan sky, began flying higher, faster, and with less accuracy to avoid the lethal reach of the missile. Close air support, the hammer of Soviet ground tactics, became unreliable. Transport helicopters resupplying remote outposts became flying coffins. The invincibility of the Hind was shattered. The Big Safari intelligence had effectively democratized air defense, handing the keys to the sky to a guerrilla force. For the Soviet military command, this was an intolerable paradox. Their most sophisticated technological shield, their IADS, had been rendered partially transparent by a platform they could not legally engage. The harassment tactics had failed to deter the missions. The diplomatic protests they filed through back channels were met with cool, formal denials from the United States, pointing to flight plans and civilian air traffic control records. The RC-135 had become a symbol of American impunity and Soviet impotence. This humiliation directly influenced the Soviet military's brutal scorched earth tactics in the latter half of the war, including the widespread use of booby traps, like the Butterfly PFM-1 mine, and the systematic destruction of agriculture and infrastructure. If they could not secure the air through electronic means, they would deny the enemy cover and sustenance from the ground. For the United States intelligence community, the Afghan operation was an unqualified, transformative success. It proved the irreplaceable value of dedicated, manned strategic reconnaissance in a contested environment. Satellites could not loiter. U-2s were too vulnerable and politically sensitive. The RC-135 in its deceptive guise was the perfect tool. The data collected went far beyond immediate tactical use. The library of Soviet radar and communication signatures gathered over Afghanistan became the core dataset for U.S. electronic warfare for a generation. When U.S. forces engaged the Soviet-built air defenses of Iraq in 1991 during Operation Desert Storm, they did so with an intimate knowledge of their capabilities. The jamming profiles of the EF-111 Ravens and A-6B Prowlers, the suppression tactics of the F-4G Wild Weasels, and the very flight paths used to evade Iraqi SA-2 and SA-3 sites were all built upon the foundation laid by the Big Safari missions over the Hindu Kush. The program itself entered a new era of prestige and funding. The RC-135 fleet was continually upgraded. The Rivet Joint received the Senior Scout and Senior Siren SIGINT suites, moving from analog tape reels to digital recording and near real-time data fusion. The Combat Sense unique radar fingerprinting capabilities were recognized as a national asset. The success also validated the Big Safari model of rapid, bespoke modification, ensuring its survival and expansion into the age of unmanned vehicles and cyber warfare. Yet, this success was shadowed by a profound and lasting moral and strategic consequence. The direct line from the RC-135's collection to the Stinger's lethality cemented the U.S. Mujahideen alliance. Weapons, training, and intelligence flowed in a single powerful stream. But the United States, in its focus on bleeding the Soviet Union, had empowered a hydra. The very networks and commanders who received this support, figures like Jalaluddin Haqqani and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, would later turn their expertise and their fanaticism against their former benefactors. The CIA officers who helped coordinate the flow of intelligence understood they were making a Faustian bargain, but in the context of the Cold War, the Soviet Empire was the immediate devil. The blowback was a problem for a future day. The war below was rushing toward its conclusion, but the war in the shadows, the war of antennas and deception, was permanent. The Soviet Union might withdraw, but the mission of the Phantom airliner would only evolve, finding new adversaries and new borders to haunt. The final withdrawal of Soviet troops across the Amu Darya Bridge in February 1989 did not end the mission of the Big Safari aircraft. It merely changed their address. As the last BTRs rolled north, the RC-135s continued their orbits. Now their focus shifted to monitoring the chaotic civil war that erupted between the Mujahideen factions, and critically, to tracking the dispersal of Soviet military technology, including nuclear-capable systems and advanced air defense components, left behind in the crumbling DRA state. The Phantom had outlasted its original prey. For the Soviet air defense officers who had spent years tracking the elusive airliners, the aftermath was one of bitter professional disillusionment. They had been outmaneuvered not in a contest of weapons, but in a contest of guile and legalistic daring. The sophisticated IADS they had built, a source of immense pride, had been systematically mapped and exploited by an enemy that hid behind a civilian silhouette. In the internal postmortems of the General Staff, the failure to neutralize the RC-135 missions was likely noted as a critical intelligence vulnerability, one that would inform future Russian military thinking about hybrid threats and the use of civilian platforms for warfare. The seeds of a deep-seated Russian paranoia about NATO reconnaissance activities, which would later manifest in aggressive intercepts over the Baltic and Black Seas, were sown in the skies over Afghanistan. The legacy of the deception itself entered a new, more dangerous phase. The 1983 KAL-007 tragedy had already demonstrated the lethal potential of mistaken identity. The RC-135 operations in Afghanistan proved that the superpowers were willing to aggressively exploit that ambiguity. This established a perilous norm. In the post-Cold War world, nations like China, Iran, and North Korea observed the lessons. They began developing their own versions of civilian reconnaissance platforms and employing little green men and fishing trawlers, bristling with antennas. The line between civilian and military in the global commons, air, sea, and cyberspace, was permanently blurred. The Big Safari doctrine had pioneered a form of warfare that was deniable, provocative, and endlessly replicable. Technologically, the program never stood still. The RC-135V/W rivet joint remains the backbone of the USAF's airborne SIGINT fleet, with airframes that are over 60 years old but with internals constantly refreshed, most recently under the rivet joint recapitalization effort, which is essentially building new aircraft around the classic frame. The specific RC-135U combat cent, the radar-sniffing specialist, continued its unique mission until its retirement in the 2020s, its capabilities presumably folded into newer, even more classified platforms. The missions continued, over the Balkans in the 1990s, providing real-time intelligence on Serbian air defenses, over Iraq and Afghanistan again in the 2000s, tracking insurgent communications, and constantly along the borders of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. The human legacy is more personal. For the veterans of the 55th SRW who flew those missions, the war in Afghanistan was a silent, stressful watch. They received no combat medals for hours spent under the gunlock of a MiG-23. Their stories remain largely locked in classified vaults. Yet, their contribution formed the invisible architecture of modern electronic warfare. Every time a coalition aircraft flies into contested airspace with an accurate jamming profile, or a drone operator listens in on an adversary's radio network, they are utilizing a craft honed in the cold, thin air over the Hindu Kush. The ultimate ironic aftermath, however, lies in the very landscape the planes were once tasked to monitor. 2 decades after the Soviet withdrawal, the United States found itself conducting its own brutal counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. And in a haunting echo, a new generation of American commanders now faced an invisible threat: the ubiquitous, unencrypted signals from their own troops' personal cell phones and poorly secured tactical radios, monitored by insurgents using cheap commercial scanners. The hunter had become the watched. The lesson of the RC-135, that the electromagnetic spectrum is a battle space where dominance is never permanent, had come full circle. The Phantom had taught that to listen is to possess power, but it had also revealed that no power can forever conceal its own electronic heartbeat. From the desperate need to map a Soviet air defense network sprang a legacy of enduring capability, strategic ambiguity, and a sobering lesson in the law of unintended consequences. The silent war had ended, but its echoes would shape conflicts for decades to come. The story of the Big Safari planes over Afghanistan is not ultimately a tale of a single aircraft or a specific mission. It is a parable about the nature of power in the modern age. In a conflict celebrated for the primitive image of the tribesman with a Golden Age rifle, the decisive edge often came from the most advanced, silent technology imaginable, operating in a realm beyond sight or sound. These missions represented a fundamental shift in warfare, the elevation of knowing above destroying. The RC-135 carried no bombs, no missiles. Its weapon was comprehension. It sought not to break the enemy's body, but to map its nervous system, to understand the precise frequency of its radar's pulse, the dialect of its radio operators, the daily rhythm of its electronic life. In doing so, it rendered a formidable military apparatus predictable and therefore vulnerable. This was a victory of intellect over ordnance, of perception over steel. The psychological dimension of this warfare is its most chilling legacy. By adopting the guise of the civilian, the aircraft weaponized doubt. It forced Soviet commanders into a paralyzing cycle of suspicion and inaction, where the cost of being wrong, of shooting down an airliner, outweighed the cost of being deceived. This was a masterful exploitation of the Cold War's rigid rules, turning international law and moral norms into a protective shield. It demonstrated that in the shadows where superpowers clashed, truth itself was a malleable weapon. Yet, the reflection must also turn inward, to the paradox at the heart of such intelligence. The exquisite knowledge gained in those orbits, used to sharpen the stinger's sting and guide the mujahideen's ambush, was tactical genius. But it was strategic blindness. The focus was on bleeding the Soviet bear, with little vision for the world that would remain once the bear retreated. The same electronic maps that led to Soviet helicopter kills also helped build the networks of groups that would later nurture global jihad. The Phantom, in its silent watch, helped unleash forces its creators could not control. Today, as RC-135s and their descendants continue their endless orbits, now over the Black Sea, the South China Sea, and the deserts of the Middle East, the lessons of Afghanistan endure. They remind us that the most critical battles are often fought not with thunder, but with silence. Not with the blinding flash of warheads, but with the steady, invisible accumulation of data. The Phantom airliner teaches that in the modern world, to see the unseen, to hear the silent, is to hold the ultimate advantage. But it also whispers a warning, that the weapon of perfect knowledge carries with it the grave responsibility of foresight, a responsibility that, in the mountains of Afghanistan, was both magnificently fulfilled and tragically overlooked. The Phantom remains airborne. Its mission eternal. Its lesson forever ambiguous.